And it was a very puzzling and curious gift. It was the gift of religious ignorance. Do you want it? And in this gift, later on, years later, I discovered that the Father not only forgives this gift, but rewards it. He did this on the cross. He forgave ignorance. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. They are ignorant. And he's still forgiving it. And in the parable of the prodigal son, the father rewarded an ignorant prayer. That boy asked for his portion and prayed a selfish prayer, and the father gave him his portion and sent him off into riotous living, knowing that sooner or later he would come to himself and get to the end of his rope and come home, back home again. Well, when I was young in this quest, I didn't have any more sense than to believe that God would answer my selfish prayers. I didn't know I was praying amiss. I didn't know that until I'd read quite a bit of theology and religion. And after I had begun to study religious matters and getting a smattering of theology, I began to find my faith slipping away from me. All gamblers, when they begin their gambling careers, when they're young in it, they play the game not to win, but the joy that they get out of it, and they play with tremendous faith. I was a professional gambler one time, and we professionals never played with a beginner. For there was such a thing that we knew as beginner's luck, and we would wait until they learned the game. And when they had learned the game, they became cautious. And caution means a lack of faith. And the more cautious they got, the easier they were to beat. Well, it's the same in prayer. We can learn so much about it that without knowing it, we become cautious. And we wonder, am I praying amiss? Should I pray this selfish prayer? And we hesitate. But in the beginning, in my case, I had needs which were selfish. And they were needs that were keyed to this material plane. Back in the year 1930, on the 1st of March, I was headed out into the free world after spending most of my life in the penitentiary and on chain gangs and road camps and turpentine farms and everything else. And I didn't have any equipment to go out into the world with. I had never done any work. Had worked a little bit in the harvest fields and things like that. I'd hardly earned an honest dollar in all my years. I didn't have any kind of a trade, didn't know how to work. I had no profession. And if you remember, some of you, in 1930, there was a Great Depression on. And nearly everyone in the United States was out of work. Millions of people were tramping the streets, and these were men and women with great talent and capacity and professions and trades, technical skills. Yet all the industry, the smokestacks of industry were just empty, no smoke coming out. And so everybody was unemployed practically, and I had to go out into that. with no equipment at all to get a job and to make a decent, respectable living, and to face a society that I'd never known, for I'd never lived in the social world. I'd only lived in the underworld. Now, could you go out under those circumstances with a great panic on, with no equipment, no way to work, no capacity of any kind to do anything and earn a living? Could you compete with the millions and millions of people who are out of work? The day before I went out, a very brilliant cynic from the Identification Bureau came over to discourage me. And he sat in the convalescent ward of the hospital where I worked and spent 2 hours trying to make me feel as though I were helpless. And he told me all the reasons why I could not make good on the outside with my past record. And it had been a long, black and bleak record. Nothing really to recommend me. And he brought all these things up. He told me that he would give me 60 days to remain on the outside. You will wear a burlap suit out of here, he said, and a pair of prison-made shoes, and a hat that's made in prison, and a hat that has no equal anywhere in the world. Everybody will look at you, and everybody will know you, and you will have a $10 bill that the state gave you, and with that you are supposed to go out and make good. He said the first time the rain hits that suit, the pants legs will crawl up to your knees, and the sleeves will come up to your elbows, and that hat will go limp. Then he said your $10 will be gone, and you will either have to beg or steal. And if I know you, you're not going to beg. Therefore, you're going to steal. And I predict that you will be back here or somewhere else like this within 60 days. But he also was ignorant, as ignorant as I was. And I told him, I said, I'm not interested in this burlap suit. It's all right. But for me to live is not this suit. For me to live is Christ. This old rag that's going to hang on me has nothing whatever to do with it. Redemption is an inside job and not an outside job. And I am absolutely convinced that Christ never fails, never has and never will. And I said, as far as a job is concerned, I don't belong to a job. I belong to Christ. All I have to do is to let him live in me. He's my shepherd and my guide. I can take this great statement of Paul just as well as Paul took it himself. For me to live is Christ, and for me to die is gain. I had that kind of primitive faith. My faith hadn't been corrupted yet. I hadn't read it away yet. I hadn't studied it away. It was just a simple peasant-like type of faith, a childlike type of faith that took that great statement of Paul's for granted. For me to live is Christ. There isn't anything else. And to the extent that I can achieve this by faith. I have no worries. And I said to this man, I wish you would go up to the warden and ask him for the privilege of letting your beard grow. And if you let it grow till I come back, it will be dragging on the ground. Well, now here are these selfish prayers. I didn't know any different. I was just ignorant. I didn't have any more sense than to believe that God would answer these frightful prayers. And I put them all down on a list so I couldn't forget them. And the first one that I put down on that list was the most impossible thing in all the world. I put down there, I prayed that after having had my wonderful experience in solitary confinement at a time when I was at the lowest ebb physically, and when my will finally broke and the will of God came in and chased out all crime and everything pertaining to it, then I knew right then and there the answer to every individual problem and the collective problem of the world. I had lived on a philosophy of hate, and I had succeeded, for hate never fails. Hate always destroys the hater, just as love restores the lover. And when my will finally broke, under great pressure and torture and pain, for my body could no longer assimilate pain, there was nothing left but skin and bones. For many years I had been able to assimilate the pain imposed upon me by third-degree methods in the police world. For if you can hate enough, if you can hate the one who is injuring you enough, you can assimilate the pain, absorb it, and not feel it. Hate is the next door neighbor to love. It is love turned upside down. It is exactly the same energy used differently. And I had received the philosophy of love, which wrung out of me the philosophy of hate. And it took everything else out of me that had to do with my criminal life. I was healed spiritually and left untouched physically, and I might say mentally. And so when I decided to go out, I was very naive. And I went out believing, automatically, without any effort, that God would answer these selfish prayers. So I put down on that list and prayed about it that I wanted to be able, through the written word, to honor the Lord Jesus by putting into publication the written word, some of the great things he had done for me in solitary confinement. I wanted to report. Well, I had a fifth grade education. And all that education had been hammered out of me during my years in the underworld. I had no vocabulary to amount to anything except profanity and underworld slang. And now I needed a completely new vocabulary if I were going to report what Jesus had done for me. And I had to trust that somehow, some way, I'd be guided into ways and means of unfolding or developing this new divine vocabulary. So brazenly, I put that down, what I wanted to do when I went out. This would not only be a very practical way to earn a living, but it would also be a wonderful way to express what was in my heart out of gratitude for what I had received spiritually. Well, I didn't have any grammar. I always liked the great parabolic story that Glenn Clark tells about grammar. I heard him say this on the public platform. He was a professor of English and grammar composition. And I heard him say on the platform that he had never in all his life made but one mistake in grammar, and I marveled at that statement. And then he said, just as soon as I done it, I seen it. I didn't know how I was going to be able to write for publication. I didn't know how I was going to master the mysterious elements of punctuation. I didn't know how I was going to manage writing correct sentences or anything else. But I think I've been helped mostly through the years by school teachers who have appeared in the CFO camps. They have pointed out to me my errors and my grammatical usage. It took me a long time. Many school teachers helped me with split infinitives. And after a long while, I caught on to it. And I don't do that much anymore. And they told me about prepositions and not to dangle them way out on the end of a sentence. And I haven't quite mastered that, but I'm working at it, and I know that I shouldn't. So I'm working along that line. And as far as my punctuation is concerned, I don't know anything about that yet. I can sometimes adequately get a comma in the right place. But when it comes to a semicolon or a colon, I put a dash there. Well, I was in pretty bad shape to try to do anything like this, but I had the gift of ignorance. And in this ignorance, I was forgiven and rewarded. So I would just send my stuff in to the publisher, and so to speak, I would send an extra envelope full of the punctuation marks. One of my publishers, a big one in this country, I apologized for not knowing where to put these marks. Oh, he said, don't bother about it. We've got Harvard students here who've mastered that. We're not interested in your punctuation marks. We want your thoughts. And so I would send it in, and they would kindly fix it all up. And that's the way it's been going. So I did. I prayed for help in this particular area. And it's rather amazing. I'm astonished myself at what has come out of that. That prayer just keeps on being answered and answered and answered. I write in a strange way. I don't have any struggle about it. I just sit down in front of a typewriter and I get a little inspiration, and then I write down the first line, and then I just go from there. I just let it roll out. I use the hunt and peck system on the typewriter. And somehow or other, I don't pay any attention to the fingers. I don't know they're operating. They operate this typewriter. And the creative mind takes care of the vision. And then after the vision comes the revision. A wonderful thing, the way that prayer has been answered. And then I put down, I prayed that I want to be a public speaker. That was something. I was shy, had stage fright, very timid, had been booed out of the prison chapel trying to speak once. But I put that down anyway, even though it were impossible. Then, finally, I decided that I was going to say yes to every invitation that might come to me in future years to speak in public. And after saying yes, then sweat it out till the day came. You know, I found out about this stage fright and this shyness that God is not likely to take that away from certain people. I don't think he has ever taken it away from a great opera singer. I think the greatest of the opera singers have had that all through their careers. And before going out before the footlights to sing, they would stand out in the wings of the theater and just live 100 years emotionally scared to death. And this fear would excite all the endocrine glands in their body. And all this energy would be pumped into the body through this fear. And then they would step out before the footlights and open their mouths, and all fear and stage fright would vanish. And with all this energy, they would take the audience by storm. I know that God, if we'll say yes and then go through with it, that he will never fail to give us the courage to finish it. Maybe not too much, but just enough. Just enough to get through it, and then the next time you have to do it all over again. So I've never gotten rid of it, and now I don't care to get rid of it. I kind of love it. So I would say that if you have this timidity and this shyness and this fear, don't bother about it. Just say yes, and then barge out. Barge out. He will always give you enough courage to accomplish what you want to do and what you set out to do. So I put that down on the list and prayed for it. And just in this writing prayer, the prayer for writing, I have produced that way without really knowing anything about it much. I think it's some 20 books, and they've all been based upon this indestructible motto, injunction of St. Paul. For me to live is Christ. Christ liveth in me, and his strength is made perfect in me. And so is his courage. And to keep centered in that and have him for the central frame of reference all the time. And have no idea of anything except to glorify him and honor him and report him for what he is willing to do. A wonderful thing. He never fails. There's a sign that's up everywhere. You see it. Jesus never fails. And he doesn't. But we have to have this kind of primitive, childlike, naive faith that we'll pray even for these practical, selfish things. Now, I needed these things. They were practical. I couldn't have gone out in the world and competed during that depression without having these practical prayers answered. It would have been impossible. But they were answered. And I'll pray for practical, selfish things today just as quickly as I prayed back there. Just as quickly. I know that I can command the Lord Jesus just as he can command me. And the only thing that I have to do is to command him is to have an adequate faith in him. He will never fail to respond to anyone's faith if it is adequate. But he can't respond to little faith. He will inevitably respond to faith that is sufficient. Therefore, faith commands him to act. That Roman soldier, who was a man of great authority, came to Jesus and he said, I am a man of authority. If I say to one of my soldiers, come, he comes. If I say go, he goes. And if he disobeyed, his head would be whacked off. Now he was a pagan, an idolater, an officer in Caesar's legions. He wasn't a Christian, but he commanded Jesus to obey him. Jesus cannot in any way, shape, form, or fashion disobey faith. He's got to respond to it, and he will respond to it if it is adequate. And it doesn't make any difference who it is exercising the faith. It's faith itself that counts. And so he told Jesus, I'm a man of authority. And here was Jesus, after having gone down and along the dusty roads, his robe all sweaty, having perhaps never been 100 miles away from his hometown except when they took him to Egypt. And it was claimed that he was not a learned man and never had an education. 18 years of his life a mystery, a blank. And here he was in his sandals and sweating, just an itinerant preacher going along. And here this stalwart Roman captain, all dressed up in his military togs, a great athletic body like those Romans had. And he came to this humble man, and he said to him, if you will stand right there in your tracks and point and say to my servant, send the word to my servant will be healed. Faith. And Jesus turned to his disciples, his own Galilean friends who had been with him, and he said to them, I have not seen such faith, no, not in Israel. And he sent his word and healed the servant of that pagan, idolatrous military officer. He responded to faith. And so it is, if we have that kind of simple, uncomplicated, childlike faith, like peasants have in Central Europe, he will respond to it. And so that prayer has been answered. I know what a frightful speaker I am, but I'm better than Glenn Clark was. I once challenged him to debate. And he wouldn't accept, because he knew that I was better. I don't know whether I told you about a terrible situation I got in saying yes to James Kraft, the cheese man. I'd been up in his offices in Chicago and autographed some books for his executives. And he asked me to speak in the university chapel. And I didn't allow myself any time to hesitate, and I just said yes. And I certainly did live 100 years emotionally before that came off. By the time it came off, I was a rag in a wreck. And I got over there among all that brain trust. I hardly knew what to do with my little 5th grade background. And the man who took me over to the church, the chapel they called it, didn't seem to me like a chapel. It was about a block long. And the backdrop in there was a half a block. And there was a stone pulpit and a stone seat. And the audience was way out here. And behind me, all this empty space. And he took me up there finally and sat me down and made an ungodly introduction of about 3 words. But I said to him on the way over, what do you think I ought to talk about? And I was thinking about talking about a minute. And then he comforted me by saying, well, there's an authority out there in your audience on every subject under the sun. If I were you, I'd talk about God. No authority there on that. But I sat up there waiting, and I was as lonely as Benedict Arnold. And I gave them a testimony, and they all sat there, and I don't know whether they were taking it in or not, but I gave it anyway, and as soon as I started giving it, all my fear left, and I became very tender and loving. And I realized that they were all God's children out there. He had made them all, and they were all good, for everything that he made was good. And that when you got beneath the skin, they were all pretty much the same. All of the same blood to dwell upon the face of the earth, and I got great relief and gave them a testimony. And after it was over, about a dozen of those students and a professor gathered with me in a parlor, and we had a wonderful prayer time and discussion. And I think most of those students made a commitment to follow the Lord. I don't know that any of them were converted or anything like that, but we had a great time. So if you say yes and don't allow yourself time to say no, if you allow yourself a little time, you will say no. Just blurt it out, quick. Say yes. Say yes to the Father. Decide to obey the commandments of the Son, and unite with the ministry of the Holy Spirit, and God will honor that Trinity. Well, as I say, that took care of the creative aspect. I wanted to write, and I did. And I wanted to speak, and I did after a fashion there. And then I put down there, I wanted to help prisoners and to help change the United States prison system. Well, here I was with nothing at all in the background, just a long black record. And I wanted to change the prison system. I wanted to change wardens and everybody else. Talk about nerve. I prayed that selfish prayer and I've seen great changes. I believe I sent one of my disciples in prison a letter that I think I sent that letter, let Tommy read it. This boy was up in McNeil Island in Washington, federal prison. And I was up there having some meetings and got acquainted with him, and he was a prison baby, been in all his life. And I made a statement in my talk there that redemption is an inside job. And then I elaborated upon that, and it clicked with this boy. Now he's the editor on their prison paper, and he conducts a workshop, and it's well attended. I think there's something like 100 attends that workshop of his. The chaplains both participate in it, and he also heads up Alcoholics Anonymous there. And he's just coming along fine, and he's had a gradual unfolding conversion experience. He's ready to come out. And when he comes out, I'm quite sure that we can take care of him. I don't think he'll ever go back anymore. And so there's been quite a bit of change in the prison system. I don't know what I would give to have the privilege of selecting 200 evangelists to become chaplains in the prisons, the federal and state prisons in this country, as I am persuaded that if I could select 200 burning, fiery evangelists filled with the Holy Spirit, full of wisdom and love, that I could stop at least 70% of first offenders going into our prisons from ever going back again. And I believe that I could decrease the old offender ranks 50% in 5 years if I had this kind of a chaplaincy at the center of the prisons. I just know that it could. Well, I've met with so many of the criminologists and the penologists. I had conferences with them, I've talked with them, I've spoken to their students. I've had wonderful opportunities to fraternize with some of the leading prison authorities in the country. And all doors now, all prison doors are open to me. They opened to let me out, now they're open to let me in. And the last door to open was a federal prison. And a year ago, last fall, that barrier was broken down in McNeil Island Federal Prison. So that from now on, I'll be able to go into the federal prisons. And so there has come out of that prayer for this ministry also quite a large measure of answer. And I put down on that list that I wanted romance. What do you know about that? I had never lived in any world except a womanless world. And it was a sordid, sardonic world. None of the beautiful refinements of women were in it. None of that keen perception and intuition that they have was in it. It was all sordid. And none of the beauty that women have was in that world. I'll tell you, when you live in a world divorced from the spiritual capacities and receptivities and responses that women have to God, you are really living in hell. There is nothing but depravity on the outside of a world filled with women. I know that they are keenly aware They're not always courageous enough to express what they know inwardly, but nevertheless it's there. And I wanted to get into that world where there were some women. So I wanted romance, and I put that down. Very selfish and prayed for it. And it was practical. It wasn't just poetry. It had a practical aspect. And I wanted marriage. I wanted to get married. I didn't know who on earth would have me, but I put it down anyway. Well, that came about. That prayer was answered, and I met my wife. And we had this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful relationship of agreement of opposites. Have you got that? Very interesting. There is power when opposites agree, and the only place they can agree is up here in the spiritual world. They have no agreement here much. And that's the way it should be. There's some power in the agreement of similars, but to tell you the truth, I don't believe there are very many similars in marriage. It may look like similarity, but my feeling is that one of the couple will be submissive to the other. And it's not similarity at all. Oh, my wife and I had the agreement of opposites. Everything I said, she disagreed with. Everything she said, I disagreed with. And then we had a pledge that before bedtime, we'd come up here and agree in the spiritual world and not let the sun go down on our wrath. That's a marvelous thing, to have the cross-fertilization of these opposite views and then bring it all up here and put it in Christ. And what a wonderful thing he does with it. A great stimulation, a great inspiration, what he can do with that. Well, last winter, November, I believe it was, my wife and our little dog, Tippy, were driving down to Temple City, California, to our daughters. And I stood out in the yard. She was behind the wheel. And I had an overwhelming compulsion to stop her and not let her go. And yet, something about it made me stand in my tracks and allow her to go on. I stood there looking down the road as far as I could see the car go. And she got down on the freeway. And there was apparently a drunk driver. It was reported that he was going at a terrific speed, probably 80 or 90 miles an hour. And he hit her car in the rear and just knocked it clear off the highway and knocked her down under the dashboard, and there was a great brain concussion. And so she had to be operated on 3 times, taking out these hemorrhaging clots. And this laid her up in a convalescent home where she is now. But it also did a wonderful thing. When our daughter and I finally were able to relinquish her to God, and it was very difficult for me to do, for I imagined all kinds of things, difficulties that I would have without her help. She'd always been such a great help to me, and in my writings. I'd read everything to her, and she would tell me whether it was any good or whether it wasn't any good. And she was a ruthless critic about my stuff, and I would argue with her about it. I'd say, but dear, you're not a writer. What do you know about it? Well, she'd say, I don't know. That's just the way I feel. Well, I'd say, no, isn't there any reason? Don't you have some reason about it or logic? Can't you point out why it's no good? No, I just feel it. Well, I'd go away frustrated with that. I'd say, well, it seems to me very good. Then I'd go out to the typewriter and do it like she wanted it. And always it panned out right. Or I didn't do it as she wanted it a time or two, and they sent my stuff back to me. Now, I was going to miss all this and all the other helps that she could give me and had given me through the years. And so it was very hard for me emotionally to relinquish her. And up to the time that I hadn't relinquished her and had kept her earthbound by my emotions, she was in a very deplorable condition, suffering, terrible suffering. And just as soon as our daughter and I got together and sat down and talked a while about it and reasoned with each other about it, then got down and prayed about it, and we let her go, released her. And just as soon as we released her, these operations she had had on her brain cut her off from all past negative memory